Well, it is it's difficult to measure it that way because the extent of the abuses is very high. There are few situations where there has been accountability, but very, very limited and mostly non-conflict situations. But in conflict situations like what we have in South Sudan, Ethiopia, DRC, and 15 other countries that we documented, there has been absolutely no accountability. So it's really difficult to measure it. But if I was to measure, particularly in the conflict situations, I would place it at maybe 2. But in the non-conflict situations like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, maybe South Africa, it could maybe be about 4 or 5. Accountability is a major problem in Africa.
State actors, but who are the main perpetrators of the widespread abuses against civilians on the continent?
Depending on which country you're looking at, they are both state actors and non-state actors. But the highest level of abuses is actually by state actors. Whether you're looking at some of the non-conflict situations like the East African and some parts of South Africa, Southern African countries, or the conflict situations like the ones I mentioned, Ethiopia, maybe Somali, Sudan, the South Sudan, DRC, Cameroon. Mostly it is the state actors, but the non-state actors have also committed serious atrocities against the populations, including rape, displacements, killings, among others.
Okay, so as you mentioned that it's somewhat different regionally, you mentioned East Africa. If you can just also give us a broad overview of some of the worst atrocities there and examples thereof. You spoke about South Africa, Southern Africa. If you can talk about that. And we know that West Africa, the Sahel region as well, has seen some of the worst atrocities, particularly in conflict. It's a lot of ground to cover, but please just take us through some of those.
In context of East Africa, I think one of the most worrying situations is Uganda and probably South Sudan. In Uganda, we have seen government security forces disappearing, basically kidnapping people in various places, including their homes, and disappearing them. And the few who have been released are making very serious allegations about where they were taken and how they were treated. Basically, they were tortured. Some of them struggle to walk when they are released. A few have been found dead, but most of them are not known where they are. Initially, this climaxed around the election period, but this kind of abuses have been going on for quite some time, I think since 2018. And our expectation was that after the elections, they will probably go down, but this has persisted. In South Sudan, the expectation was that after the peace deal was signed for the 5-year period up to maybe this year, next month, the situation would improve. The antagonistic forces would come together and the country would unite these forces. And then they will come up with an accountability mechanism, which was the hybrid court. But that never happened. The accountability mechanism has never been set up. Instead, what we see, the initial ceasefire is being violated in various states, a lot of them by state security forces who are apparently attacking opposition strongholds. But in the process, the opposition forces have also responded. And what has followed are serious human rights violations, displacements of populations, rape of women, killings of civilians, destruction of property, and the authorities have not been able to actually contain the situation meaningfully or even hold to account those who have been implicated in those violations.
So this report, which was released, further reveals that the leaders of these countries did not prioritize justice efforts for victims of atrocities. I was just reading about those who, for instance, in this one example, people who are victims of human trafficking in Myanmar, and some of them are East Africans, particularly Kenyans, and the only reasons that they've been able to be saved from slavery or even the torture that they face is because they were able to try and reach out to their government. So I'm just wondering what forms of justice that doesn't need the victim to do the work that governments should be engaging in that they're not?
In some situations, it's just a question of trying to create accountability mechanisms. The justice systems need to be working, they need to be strengthened, and they need to be accessible to the people so that when people feel they have been violated, they have a platform where they can be heard. I think in some countries, those mechanisms are weak. In countries where those mechanisms have been created, we have seen basically sometimes the government officials working to undermine them or refusing to capacitate them or give them finances. But also the justice system itself at some point becomes dysfunctional. Some of the mechanisms, if we take examples of Uganda, Kenya, or maybe even Ethiopia, in Ethiopia where there has been a ceasefire following the Tigrayan war that has been raging for about 2 years, there has been a ceasefire and the parties have come together, they're discussing, but there's still war going on in Oromia where serious abuses are happening. However, the killings that happened, killings and other abuses that happened in the Tigrayan northern part of Ethiopia, there has been no attempt to ensure accountability for those abuses. And of course, when that kind of situation happens, you see heavy movements of people, displacements, and that creates a serious humanitarian situation. Like in Ethiopia right now, there's a serious humanitarian situation with limited supplies. Initially, the government forces had cut off humanitarian aid from reaching Tigrayan region. Even though they are reaching, the needs are higher than the supply.
As you mentioned, it's about accountability. When we're talking about the justice systems, the legal frameworks that exist. I was just thinking about Mauritania, for instance, where even though slavery has been outlawed on the continent, it is a well-known fact that it exists there, that there are people who actually still inherit slaves from one family or generation to the other. So how do you make sure that where those legal instruments exist, that they are implemented? I mean, the Human Rights Watch has made recommendations, particularly to the African Union and sub-regional mechanisms, the measures and systems to ensure rigorous human rights monitoring and reporting in areas of conflict. But what about those where there isn't necessarily conflict, but there are still gross human rights violations occurring?
The African leadership has itself signed off on various treaties and charters, some which are basically regional, fronted under the auspices of the African Union. Those treaties have very clear provisions on what the authorities need to do, what their responsibilities are in terms of upholding the rights of the citizens and protecting them. Where the mechanisms have sort of been weakened, maybe because of conflict, like in the Sahel region that you mentioned, I think the challenge is how to create situations where the conflict does not undermine people's ability to get protection or to get justice for the abuses that have been committed. And this, I think, is part of the process of addressing some of the abuses that are going on in some of those situations. But in non-conflict situations, I think the issue has been the lack of political will to address the atrocities or the abuses, and basically to strengthen the available mechanisms and make them capable of responding to some of the abuses that we have been highlighting across the continent.